dear friends. We are very, very happy and excited to have as the guest of our seminar on philosophy of mind today, Swami Medhananda from California, from Center of Hindu Studies. And I would like just to pass the word immediately so that you would introduce yourself briefly and also give us today a talk on Shri Aurobindo and his Cosmopsychism. So you're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Kate, for inviting me, and thank you all for attending. I appreciate the sacrifice you're making, those of you who are interested in the World Cup, because it's a quarterfinal match between Brazil and Croatia, and it's gone into overtime. So at this very moment, they're probably going to go into overtime, but thank you. And yes, my name is Swami Medhananda. I'm a monk of the Ramakrishna Order and currently Senior Research Fellow in Philosophy at the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood. I'm Hindu chaplain at UCLA and the University of Southern California, and the author of 3 books. I'm not going to go into the titles. If you're interested, you can just type in my name on Google and you'll find all that information. And yeah, one of my abiding interests is global philosophical theories of consciousness and global approaches to problems of consciousness. And so today's talk is going to be about Shri Aurobindo's views on consciousness. It's based on an article which I shared with Kate, and I think she shared it with you guys. So I'll be kind of giving a summary of some of the main arguments in that chapter. So what I'll do is just go through this presentation and then open it up for questions. I look forward to hearing from you. So evolutionary cosmopsychism, Shri Aurobindo's solution to the hard problem of consciousness. So, as I'm sure all of you know, probably because this is a philosophy of mind course, David Chalmers is famous for having coined the phrase, the hard problem of consciousness, which has been defined in a number of subtly different ways. But one way is, how does consciousness arise from matter? This is one of the ways that that hard problem is formulated. And the inadequacy of materialist explanations of consciousness has fueled a growing interest in what's called panpsychism among contemporary philosophers of mind. And one variety of panpsychism is what's called cosmopsychism, which is a hot topic of debate now in philosophy of mind, the view that there's a single, all-pervading universal consciousness from which human and non-human consciousness derive. Among the potentially attractive features of cosmopsychism are its elegance and explanatory power. If we take universal consciousness to be the sole fundamental reality, then there's no longer any hard problem of explaining how consciousness arises from insentient matter, because everything is conscious. And there's also no need to deny or explain away the inescapably qualitative, what it is like character of consciousness. But if cosmopsychism avoids one hard problem, namely the hard problem of consciousness, it gives rise, arguably, to another. The problem of providing a coherent explanation of how the single universal consciousness individuates into the distinct conscious perspectives of various creatures. Although recent philosophers have christened this problem with different names, I follow Freya Matthews in calling it the individuation problem. Other scholars like Mira al-Bahari calls it the decombination problem, but I don't like that phrase as much because it implies a certain mereological understanding of consciousness, which I think is not correct. So individuation problem is the way I like to think about it. Proponents of cosmopsychism have proposed a variety of solutions to the individuation problem. And a few of these scholars include Philip Goff, Ite Shani, Freya Matthews, Anand Vaidya. I've done some work on this myself in my recent work. I will make the case that Shri Aurobindo, who was born in 1872 and died in 1950, he was an Indian born in Bengal, but his father sent him to England at about the age of 5 or 6. And he was educated at Cambridge University. He was a brilliant student. And then he came back to India and he became a yogi. So he was a yogi, but also a scholar at the same time. So I want to make the case that Shri Aurobindo has much to contribute to contemporary debates about consciousness and cosmopsychism. As far as I'm aware, Matthias Cornelissen is the only scholar who has discussed Shri Aurobindo's views on consciousness in detail. Cornelison plausibly argues that panpsychism is the Western concept of consciousness that comes closest to Aurobindo's view. But Cornelison does not discuss cosmopsychism in particular, and that's what I really want to focus on. Building on Cornelison's valuable work, I will make the case that Sri Aurobindo espouses a sophisticated form of cosmopsychism that has great contemporary relevance. So this is the structure of my talk. It has three parts. First part, I'll discuss Aurobindo's prescient reflections on what he calls the central problem of consciousness. Note the similarities with Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness, and his arguments against materialist reductionism. In the second part of my talk, I'm going to explain how Aurobindo developed a panentheistic philosophy of what he calls realistic Advaita on the basis of his own spiritual experiences and his intensive study of the Vedantic scriptures. He derives from this realistic Advaita philosophy a highly original doctrine of what I call evolutionary cosmopsychism, according to which the divine Satchit Ananda means existence, consciousness, bliss. It's the nature of divine reality. The divine Satchitananda is involved in everything in the universe and gradually manifests itself at each stage of the evolutionary process, from matter to life to mind, and ultimately to what he calls supermind with a capital S, the final stage that is yet to come, upon the attainment of which we will attain knowledge of our true divine nature as Satchit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. In the third part, I will outline Aurobindo's novel solution to the individuation problem, according to which the divine Satchitananda individuates into various distinct consciousnesses by playfully limiting itself through a process of what Sri Aurobindo calls exclusive concentration. So part one, first, Aurobindo on what he calls the central problem of consciousness. Over half a century before David Chalmers, Aurobindo declared that, quote, the problem of consciousness is the central problem, and contended that consciousness is an apparently insoluble miracle that eludes materialist explanation. After explaining why existence itself is the first riddle, Aurobindo formulates the second riddle of consciousness as follows. He says, consciousness of existence is a second insoluble miracle. It seems not to have been and now is, and it may be that someday it will not be. Yet it is a premier fact, and without it, being would not know of its own existence. Things might exist, but only as a useless encumbrance of a meaningless space. Consciousness makes being self-aware, gives it a significance. But what then is consciousness? Is it something in the very grain of being, or an unstable result or fortuitous accident? To whom does it belong? To the world as a whole? Or is it peculiar to individual being? Or has it come from elsewhere into this inanimate and inconscient universe? To what end this entry? So he's raising a number of very, very important questions. What makes consciousness so puzzling, Aurobindo suggests, is that it is perfectly conceivable that things could exist without conscious awareness. That is, as he says, only as a useless encumbrance of a meaningless space. This should remind us of David Chalmers' recent conceivability argument against reductionist explanations of consciousness. According to Chalmers, if a reductionist theory of consciousness were satisfactory, then zombies, creatures physically identical to us but lacking consciousness, would not be conceivable. But since zombies are conceivable, reductionist explanations of consciousness must be false. So I think Aurobindo made a similar argument decades before Chalmers. And the pregnant questions raised by Aurobindo at the end of the passage are also highly significant, since they canvass a variety of possible solutions to the riddle of consciousness, including materialism, which is the view that consciousness is an unstable result or fortuitous accident. Panpsychism, the view that consciousness is something in the very grain of being. And specifically cosmopsychism, which he refers to as the view that consciousness belongs to the world as a whole. These are all mentioned in the questions at the end of the passage I just read to you. Against the materialist hypothesis that consciousness must be a result of energy in matter, Aurobindo claims that, quote, no mere mechanism of gray stuff of brain can explain thought and will, the imagination of the poet, the attention of the scientist, the reasoning of the philosopher. And he then presents what I consider to be a sophisticated argument for panpsychism that resonates strongly with contemporary arguments in philosophy of mind. It's a long passage, but I think it's important. So this is what he says. There's no parity, kinship, or visible equation between the alleged cause or agent on the one side and on the other, the effect and its observable process. There's a gulf here that cannot be bridged by any stress of forcible affirmation or crossed by any stride of inference or violent leap of argumentative reason. Consciousness and an inconscient substance may be connected, may interpenetrate, may act on each other, but they are and remain things opposite, incommensurate with each other, fundamentally diverse. An observing and active consciousness emerging as a character of an eternal inconscience is a self-contradictory affirmation, an unintelligible phenomenon, and the contradiction must be healed or explained before this affirmation can be accepted. But it cannot be healed unless either the inconscient has a latent power for consciousness, and then its inconscience is phenomenal only, not fundamental, or else is the veil of a consciousness which emerges out of a state of involution, which appears to us as an inconscience. So this is very dense, but I want to try to unpack this for basically the rest of this presentation. According to Aurobindo, the problem with materialist theories that reduce consciousness to some physical process, such as a brain state, is that they are unable to bridge the gulf between the alleged physical cause and the effect, that is conscious experience, which remain things opposite, incommensurate with each other. He thereby anticipated Joseph Levine's well-known argument that materialist theories leave an explanatory gap between physical processes and conscious experience. Aurobindo then goes on to argue that emergentism, the view that consciousness emerged from non-conscious matter at a certain point in our evolutionary history, is self-contradictory and unintelligible. Since only like can emerge from like, and insentient matter is fundamentally unlike consciousness, the latter, consciousness, could not possibly have emerged from the former, from insentient matter. Once we rule out the possibility of emergentism, Aurobindo claims, then only two possible explanations of consciousness remain. Either the inconscient has a latent power for consciousness, which is a position akin to what contemporary philosophers of mind call pan-protopsychism, or the inconscient is what Aurobindo calls the veil of a consciousness with a capital C, meaning divine consciousness, which emerges out of a state of involution. And this is a position that Aurobindo actually defends. It's the latter position, and it's what I call an evolutionary cosmopsychism that Aurobindo will go on to defend. What should be kept in mind, however, is that he motivates his general panpsychist position on the basis of rational arguments against materialist reductionism and emergentism. In doing so, Aurobindo anticipated Galen Strawson, who has recently argued for panpsychism on the basis of the principle of ex nihilo nihil fit, from nothing comes nothing. Strawson contends, very much in an Aurobindonian vein, that, quote, there must be something about the nature of the emerged from and nothing else, in virtue of which the emerger emerges as it does and is what it is. It's also important to keep in mind that Aurobindo was first and foremost a yogi and a mystic, an illumined, or he claimed that he had many kinds of spiritual experiences. Accordingly, his evolutionary cosmopsychism was not an intellectual hypothesis arrived at through ratiocination, but an insight he claimed to have gained through his own spiritual experience. This is a quotation from one of his essays. He says, "It is not only in things animate, but in things inanimate also that we must see Narayana," meaning the divine, experience Shiva, throw our arms around Shakti. When our eyes that are now blinded by the idea of matter open to the supreme light, we shall find that nothing is inanimate, but all contains expressed or unexpressed, involved or evolved, secret or manifest, or in course of manifestation. Not only that state of involved consciousness, which we call unnum or matter, but also life, mind, knowledge, bliss, divine force, and being. Prana, manas, vijnana, ananda, chit, sat. In all things, the self-conscious personality of God broods and takes the delight of his guna, which means the qualities of sattva, rajas, and tamas comprising prakriti, nature. Flowers, fruits, earth, trees, metals, all things have a joy in them of which you will become aware, because in all Sri Krishna dwells, pravishya, having entered into them, not materially or physically, but by chit, the divine awareness or consciousness in his transcendent being. So this is clearly based on his own spiritual experiences. According to Aurobindo's spiritually grounded worldview, the sole reality is Satchit Ananda, being, consciousness, force, bliss, the infinite, impersonal, personal divine consciousness, which in its personal and dynamic aspect as Shakti manifests as everything in the universe. So there's nothing but divine consciousness, and divine consciousness manifests as everything. In his philosophical magnum opus called The Life Divine, he elaborates this divine cosmopsychism in great detail. In an illuminating letter, I don't have time to discuss the Life Divine itself in detail, but in an illuminating letter, he summarizes the core argument of the Life Divine by first outlining what he calls his realistic Advaita philosophy. Advaita means non-dualism. So his realistic Advaita philosophy, and then elaborating a highly original doctrine of evolutionary cosmopsychism. So I want to quote a passage from this very important letter. He says, there is possible a realistic as well as an illusionist Advaita. The philosophy of the Life Divine is such a realistic Advaita. The world is a manifestation of the real, and therefore is itself real. The reality is the infinite and eternal divine, infinite and eternal being, consciousness, force, and bliss, that is Satchit Ananda. This divine, by his power, has created the world, or rather manifested it in his own infinite being. But here in the material world, or at its basis, he has hidden himself in what seem to be his opposites, non-being, inconscience, and insentience. The being which is hidden in what seems to be an inconscient void emerges in the world first in matter, then in life, then in mind, and finally as the spirit. The apparently inconscient energy which creates is in fact the consciousness force of the divine, and its aspect of consciousness, secret in matter, begins to emerge in life, finds something more of itself in mind, and finds its true self in a spiritual consciousness, and finally, a supramental consciousness through which we become aware of the reality, enter into it, and unite ourselves with it. This is what we call evolution, which is an evolution of consciousness and an evolution of the spirit in things, and only outwardly an evolution of species. Again, a very rich passage, which requires a lot of unpacking. According to the 8th century Indian philosopher Shankara, his illusionist Advaita philosophy, the sole reality is the impersonal and attributeless pure consciousness. The Sanskrit term is Nirguna Brahman, which only appears to manifest as this world due to our ignorance. So in fact, there's no world. That's Shankara's Advaita philosophy. That's why Shri Aurobindo calls it illusionist Advaita, because ultimately the only reality is impersonal pure consciousness, and the world turns out to be unreal. By contrast, according to Aurobindo's realistic Advaita philosophy, the divine Satchitananda is both personal, saguna, and impersonal, nirguna. The Sat aspect of Satchit Ananda corresponds to the impersonal absolute accepted by Shankara and his followers, while the Chit aspect of Satchit Ananda is what Shri Aurobindo calls consciousness force, a personal and dynamic Chit Shakti, which has the inherent capacity to manifest in and as the world. Hence, Aurobindo, unlike Shankara, holds that everything in the world is an emphatically real manifestation of divine consciousness. According to Aurobindo, evolution has both an outer and an inner dimension. Charles Darwin's theory of physical evolution through natural selection provides a more or less accurate account of how various species have evolved in the course of the Earth's history. However, what Darwin overlooked from Aurobindo's standpoint is the inner spiritual evolution of consciousness through the mechanism not of natural selection, but of what he calls divine involution. Divine consciousness, Aurobindo claims, is involved in everything. That means latent in everything in the universe, and progressively manifests at each stage of the evolutionary process, from matter to life to mind and ultimately to supermind. Up to this point, he claims humanity has evolved to the stage of mind, which is only a transitional stage on the way to the culminating stage of supermind, upon reaching which we will realize that we are none other than the one infinite divine consciousness, playfully manifesting as everything and everyone in the universe. Moreover, he argues that the evolutionary transition from mind to supermind is inevitable, since the divine consciousness involved or latent in the human mind will necessarily press forward until it can manifest itself here on earth to the fullest extent. So now we get to this big problem, the individuation problem for Cosmopsychism. How does Aurobindo respond to the problem? Of course, Aurobindo's evolutionary Cosmopsychism raises the individuation problem in an acute form. If the sole reality is divine consciousness, then how is it possible for this omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect divine being to manifest as ordinary imperfect creatures who are ignorant of their true divine nature? In The Life Divine, Aurobindo himself raises this individuation problem quite forcefully. This is what he says. How could this manifold ignorance, or this narrowly self-limiting and separative knowledge of ordinary creatures, arise and come into action or maintain itself in action in an absolute being who must be absolute consciousness and therefore cannot be subject to ignorance? How is even an apparent division effectively operated and kept in continuance in the indivisible? The being, integrally one, cannot be ignorant of itself. And since all things are itself, conscious modifications, determinations of its being, it cannot either be ignorant of things, of their true nature, of their true action. But though we say that we are that the Jivatman or individual self is no other than the Paramatma, no other than the Absolute, yet we are certainly ignorant both of ourselves and things, from which this contradiction results that what must be in its very grain incapable of ignorance, that means God, how can God be capable of ignorance, is yet capable of it, and has plunged itself into it by some will of its being or some necessity or possibility of its nature. So I think this is a nice formulation of the individuation problem. How can the perfect and omniscient and omnipotent God manifest as ignorant creatures? Aurobindo points out here that his metaphysics of what he calls a realistic Advaita raises both a how and a why question. So two questions. The first question is the how question. How is it even coherently possible for a single perfect divine consciousness to become or manifest as all the various individual creatures, each with their own imperfections, limitations, and ignorant conscious perspectives? This, I think, is clearly a version of the individuation problem currently being discussed by philosophers of mind. But Aurobindo also raises a further why question in the final sentence of the passage, which I just read. Even if it is a coherent possibility for the divine consciousness to manifest as ignorant creatures, why would divine consciousness do so in the first place? And then he raises a few possibilities. Did the divine consciousness plunge into ignorance out of necessity? If so, then it's difficult to see how God can be truly omnipotent, if God is constrained to do certain things. And if, on the other hand, the divine consciousness chose to manifest as ignorant creatures, but could have refrained from doing so, then we would need to ask why God would make such a seemingly counterintuitive choice, which entails so much suffering for his creatures. So it raises the problem of evil. Why would God get us into such a situation with so much suffering in the world? So let's take these questions one at a time. Let's focus first on the how question, the logical coherence question. Regarding the problem of logical coherence, Aurobindo's solution in brief is that the all-knowing divine consciousness manifests as ignorant creatures through a special process of self-limitation. His account of divine self-limitation presupposes his metaphysics of what he calls a sevenfold chord of being, the seven planes of being or consciousness which it is possible for us to occupy. According to Aurobindo, the higher four planes of being, namely Sat, being, Chit Shakti, consciousness force, Ananda, bliss, and Vijnana, supermind, constitute the upper hemisphere of manifestation based on the spirit's eternal self-knowledge. So this is divine consciousness, the higher four planes of being. Obviously, the first three planes taken together constitute the divine Satchit Ananda itself, which is the soul reality and our true nature. The fourth plane of what he calls supermind is the divine gnosis, a mediating principle by which Satchit Ananda manifests as everything in the universe. Every one of us, according to Aurobindo, is capable of attaining salvific knowledge of our true divine nature by raising our consciousness to one or more of these four higher planes of being. As Aurobindo puts it, quote, if we enter into these principles or into any plane of being in which there is the pure presence of the reality, we find in them a complete freedom and knowledge. The remaining three planes of being, namely mind, life, and matter, constitute what he calls the lower hemisphere of the manifestation, which he explains as follows. These, by which he means mind, life, and matter, are in themselves powers of the superior principles, that is, Sat, Chit, Shakti, Ananda, and Vijnana, the four higher principles. But wherever they manifest in a separation from their spiritual sources, they undergo, as a result, a phenomenal lapse into a divided in place of the true undivided existence. This lapse, this separation creates a state of limited knowledge, exclusively concentrated on its own limited world order and oblivious of all that is behind it and of the underlying unity, a state, therefore, of cosmic and individual ignorance. This passage, I think, contains in a nutshell Aurobindo's response to the individuation problem. Our various ignorant conscious perspectives result from a twofold process of, first, divine self-limitation, and second, exclusive concentration. So first, the divine consciousness manifests in the world by limiting itself to the three lower planes of matter, life, and mind. And second, this self-limited consciousness becomes so absorbed in or exclusively concentrated on its own limited egoistic purview, grounded in the three lower planes, matter, life, and mind, that it loses its awareness of the divine Satchitananda at its basis. Crucially, however, Aurobindo insists that this lapse, this is his own term, lapse of Satchitananda into a state of ignorance is merely phenomenal, not in the sense of being illusory, but in the sense of being a merely superficial ignorance that belongs not to the essence of the divine consciousness of Satchitananda, but to certain aspects of the divine's manifestation here on earth. So just a few more slides. I just wanted to cover his response to the why question. Apart from the question of logical coherence, there is a further why question. Why did Satchit Ananda, divine consciousness, choose to manifest as ignorant, suffering creatures in the first place? In response to this question, Aurobindo appealed to what might be called, this is my own language, a spiritual Hegelianism. The divine Satchitananda freely chooses to plunge into inconscience and to manifest itself gradually in the course of evolution for the sake of the unique delight of achieving, this is a direct quotation from Shri Aurobindo, a new affirmation of Satchit Ananda in its apparent opposite. So anybody who studied Hegel will, I think, recognize affinities in Phenomenology of Spirit and other works. As Aurobindo puts it, it is to find himself in the apparent opposite of his being and his nature that Satchit Ananda descends into the material niches and puts on phenomenal ignorance as a superficial mask in which he hides himself from his own conscious energy, leaving it self-forgetful and absorbed in its works and forms. From Aurobindo's perspective, only the divine Satchit Ananda is so daring, so powerful, so self-assured, that it would freely choose among its infinite possibilities of manifestation, the one that involves such a deep and perilous plunge into apparent inconscience, with all of its attendant imperfection and suffering. And finally, so this is just a very kind of cursory summary of an article that was recently published in the Monist called The Playful Self-Involution of Divine Consciousness, Shri Aurobindo's Evolutionary Cosmopsychism and his response to the individuation problem. So if you want more details, please do look at that article. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Yes. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. So I will welcome everyone to ask questions or give maybe some commentaries as well. So if you would like to, you may either raise your hand or maybe just feel yourself free to comment. Natalia, please. Your microphone is, yes.
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Dear Swami, why do you think that Cosmopsychism has great contemporary relevance?
Yeah, because I think it provides a creative and arguably compelling solution to the hard problem of consciousness, basically. That's how I tried to frame the issue in the beginning of my presentation. Because if everything is consciousness, then there's no longer the hard problem, right? So then the difficulty is proving that Cosmopsychism is true or plausible. But I think at least Aurobindo tries to grapple with those issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Swami.
Hey, Anand, good to see you.
Hey, thank you. That was a very good presentation, and I actually think I gained something this time that I had missed before. So thank you very much for that version of it. And I thought actually all of the moves that you made in reference to David Chalmers made a lot of sense, and I think you're right about a lot of those things. The question I wanted to ask has more to do with wanting to learn about the proper way of understanding the complicated relationship between Sankaracharya and Shri Aurobindo. What I find really appealing in this account of Shri Aurobindo is that we don't run into the we don't run into the illusionism that is sometimes a problem in the kind of account Shankara gives. No matter what view you take of Shankara as a relative realist or a pure illusionist, it seems like you're always dealing partially with the status of the world. And in what I understood you presenting is that in Aurobindo, it's a realistic form of Advaita.
Correct.
So one thing that I wanted to now ask that you didn't go into as much is the nature of the self. Like it still seems like, or the question is this, is Aurobindo a realist about the self, the individual self? Or is he still like Sankaracharya saying that the self is kind of an illusion of a certain kind? And it seemed to me like the answer is he's definitely not the illusionist that Shankara is. And I was wondering, could you just say something or tell me where to go look to find, does he talk more about the nature of the self in this realistic vein? That's the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, he does. And I think the answer, I mean, you're right, that your intuition is right, that he's definitely not an illusionist about the self. And I think he sees that as one of the problems with Shankara's philosophy, is that ultimately, from the ultimate standpoint, no individual selves are real. But he takes the stand that the sole reality is divine consciousness, which actually manifests as our different individual selves. And so it's this kind of, so you might say, well, but wait a minute, then that means that Shri Aurobindo is still ultimately saying that we're nothing but divine consciousness. That's true. But it's also true that the divine consciousness really manifests as each of us. As part of this divine play. So that's kind of the way that I think he negotiates that.
Okay, good. Then one last final comment for this part. I think the way that you articulate the individuation problem, borrowing the phrase from Freya Matthews, but the way in which you're articulating it as related to the decombination problem stuff, I think it might actually be interesting to spell out in more detail why this version is in the same place, but also interestingly different. And I thought what I heard was that the problem as articulated in Aurobindo, using that phrase, has to do with the nature of our epistemic state, right? Why would something that is all-knowing, how would something that's all-knowing make itself ignorant? And I think that aspect is interesting to twist out. So I would just say, emphasizing that as a difference, because the decombination problem never arises in an epistemic sense. It arises in a metaphysical sense. And you were driving out an epistemic aspect.
I think it depends. I think Miri al-Bahari, who's the one who coined the phrase decombination problem, in that earlier essay, the one before perennialist idealism, it's the one in the volume, whatever the Panpsychism volume was. She actually distinguishes an epistemic form of the decombination problem from the I think, metaphysical or something. And so I think if you look back at that original article, I think you'll find similarities. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I should also just mention that Miri, she's one of the contemporary philosophers of mind that I'm really sort of critically engaging with, because she really defends a more Shankarite version or solution to the hard problem of consciousness, which ultimately says that there are no individual selves. And there's only divine, or not divine, she would say, there's only Brahman, there's only kind of impersonal, attributeless consciousness, pure consciousness. And so I think that Aurobindo provides an interestingly different solution to the hard problem of consciousness, which is almost never discussed in contemporary debates. Thank you so much, Anand.
Thank you. Niti?
Yes, dear Swami, thank you very much for such a presentation. It's really important for us to see, to communicate with people who think not only in analytic naturalist paradigm, who think just another ideas. It's really very interesting. And while listening your presentation, I two questions burn in my mind, but on one question you almost answered, but I would like to nevertheless ask it. About your attitude to two persons. First is Hegel. Yes, I see that you mentioned him, and how do you think, what is difference between Hegelism and these ideas? The first person.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, what do I see as the differences between Hegel's philosophy and Shri Aurobindo's? I mean, that would take a different lecture, I guess. But one of the things is that I think that Hegel tends to idealize the real in a certain sense. So the real is the rational, right? And so that's why he's often criticized by Marxists and people for affirming the status quo. I think that's the opposite of what Shri Aurobindo does. So while I think that there are sort of structural similarities, I think there are fundamental differences, because there's a spiritual telos in Aurobindo's philosophical worldview. We are currently in a state of ignorance. This is not the ideal state, the state we find ourselves in, either at the level of the world, but also at the level of most individuals who have not yet. So the whole telos is to realize our true divine nature. I don't think Hegel, I think there are many, and you know, Shri Aurobindo is all about sort of denying egoism and challenging it. And I'm not sure Hegel is so, you know, he was not, Aurobindo was not an ascetic, but he was definitely he insisted on the need to overcome worldly attachments, worldly desires, and I think Hegel would not at all have accepted that. Schopenhauer would have been much more sympathetic to Shri Aurobindo's ideas on spiritual practice, on, you know, the need to overcome egoism. Hegel was a great egoist, I would say, in a certain sense. And so, yeah, that's one of the differences. But of course, there are many subtle differences as well.
Yes, yes. And another person, I think you have never heard about him. It's a Russian biologist mostly, but a philosopher also, Vladimir Vernadsky. He developed a concept of biosphere. He didn't create it, but he developed it, and he proved some laws of biosphere as biologist. And as a philosopher, he developed this concept to concept of noosphere. Noosphere. It consists of two Greek words also. First, nous, mind, sphere of mind. And he showed that evolution of biosphere is coming to social evolution, evolution of mind. But now he lived in beginning of 20th century. In this time, man is trying to overcome biosphere, biology, but it's wrong way. He proved that it's a wrong way we should co-evaluate. He's also his term, evaluate together humanity, society, sphere of mind, and biosphere, and create a some new sphere as sphere of mind, biosphere, noosphere.
I see.
Yes. Have you ever heard about it?
No, that's extremely interesting. I mean, so it sounds similar in some ways, but I guess one difference might be that Aurobindo thinks that we're currently in the stage of mind, because humans have developed a mind. So we move beyond, I think, biosphere in this Russian thinker's sense, and are in the sphere of mind, the noosphere maybe, at a certain level. Maybe this Russian thinker is thinking of noosphere in maybe a different sense. But Aurobindo is saying the next phase in our evolution is from mind to supermind. And it would be interesting to ask whether what this guy would think of supermind. Is it even possible? And, so what is, I think maybe a lot depends on what he means by noosphere. Because Aurobindo distinguishes higher mind from lower mind. There are different gradations of mind. And he thinks that we're at a certain level of mental evolution that needs to be ultimately transcended.
It's like a sphere of society more.
I see.
Society and social spirit, social mind.
Okay.
And it's important that it's not only mind, but beside it, it's has some moral aspect. Moral aspect according to attitude to biosphere, because we shouldn't overcome, shouldn't stand over, but taking into attention our connection to.
This sounds really interesting. I mean, thank you for pointing me to him. How do you spell his last name?
Verna, I will write it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. Appreciate that.
I will write it.
Vernadsky. Somebody wrote it. Oh, okay, great. Vernadsky. Okay, thank you.
Vernadsky.
Yes.
Thank you.
I would like to follow up with the questions as well. So Dmitry has just mentioned Hegel, and I know Swami Medhananda that you wrote a couple of articles in a book on German idealism as well. But what the person which came to my mind immediately when I was listening to this idea of involution, like there is the hidden potential of divine mind that makes itself ignorant by making a decision to start the evolution in this way of like raising or sort of ladder of steps of getting back to this divine gnosis. The person which came to my mind immediately was Schelling, who was to a certain extent in dialogue and also in some controversies as well in later period with Hegel.
Right.
With his philosophy, which is definitely more in Christian paradigm, but still he is trying to overcome these in a more, I would say, general understanding of philosophy of mythology, and then the philosophy of religion. His idea is that God reveals himself, but not immediately, but after some periods. Therefore, there is not only a principle of necessity, but also a principle of freedom. So my question is here, whether in the presentation that you offered today, it seems that as the framework was about hard problem of consciousness, the whole problematic looks more like the evolution in its like epistemological aspect. But what is maybe the possible ethical or worldview aspect of this evolution? Because for Schelling, definitely the question would be to focus on the freedom and the ethical implications out of it. So it's about like being ignorant creature, but also a free creature. And then it makes difference, for example, to see the evolution of species, but individuals are those who may show the variety of these free choices, make possible the spirit to manifest. But what would be Sri Aurobindo's version there? Because I'm not that much familiar.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, late Schelling is really interesting. I mean, his views evolved in so many phases, you know, starting from when he was a teenager, and you're thinking of the late period. And I think in the late period, he was actually influenced to a certain extent by Indian thought. He started becoming interested in the Upanishads, I believe, and Max Muller, who was a great German Indologist, I think he came and spoke to him several occasions. And so I don't think some of the parallels that we're finding in late Schelling and Shri Aurobindo are purely coincidences. I think that there might actually be conceptual overlaps there, possible influences also. Yeah, and in terms of what you said about late Schelling's idea about freely and ethically trying to manifest the divine, I think that's more or less right. Certainly the ethical part is right. So there, I think that Shri Aurobindo would agree that we have to overcome selfishness and egoism to realize our deeper divine nature as consciousness. But the free thing is a little bit more complicated, I think, because I'm thinking actually at some point of writing a separate research article just on Shri Aurobindo's views on free will. I think at the end of the day, he denies free will, because I think if you just consistently claim that the only reality is divine consciousness, then divine consciousness alone can be free. And we as individual conscious souls, so long as we remain ignorant of divine consciousness, we think we're free. But when we realize our true nature as divine consciousness, we're free as divine consciousness, but not as individual souls. So it's divine consciousness working through us. I think that would be the way that Shri Aurobindo actually thinks about it. And the goal for us is, and this is part of ethical and spiritual practice, is to surrender to the divine and become instruments, pure instruments of the divine will, something like that. So I wonder whether Schelling's emphasis on freedom, if it's divine freedom, that's one thing, then I think they'd agree. But if it's really freedom at the human level, distinct from the divine, I think that would be problematic for Aurobindo.
Well, I assume this would be sort of problematic, because for Schelling it is important that this free will, which is actually mirroring the free will of God as such, but it's still like split and manifested in many individuals. So the person, the concept of person here remains as highly important, because there's this difference of what basically works in, as far as I'm concerned, in Indian philosophy as the karmic principle for each creature. So here this is a certain, not a karmic, but still this principle of free act, by which the God gives it to us like fully, by limiting its potential, so that the human would be possibly like a godly human or divine human in its potential, as Jesus Christ would be the exemplary of this realization. But still there is a potential for a person not to follow the pure divine God, but to realize it in some like inclined way, inclined in passions or something like this. But still, thank you so much. I think this is a big big issue still, and I would just mention one concept in Schelling that you might be interested in, which is called divine irony. Because the divine irony is a very interesting concept to show how unconscious is possible in God, though God is almighty and definitely has the omniscient full knowledge. Because it's like the irony which is used here is a concept to show how God can be ignorant, not being ignorant.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you. You know, I mean, that's interesting, because Schelling was at an earlier period part of the Romantic school, right? And so irony was a very important concept in German Romanticism, and I have a chapter in my first book on Friedrich Schlegel's views on irony, and so I think maybe Schelling is partly building on that and also going beyond it.
Yes, definitely. But he a little bit moved. He made a step further, because he is like in argue with the Romanticism about this concept.
Right.
This is interesting here.
That's extremely interesting. Thank you so much, and that clearly has resonance with the individuation problem.
Yes, thank you. And there is also a question from Aliskander. I would probably read it aloud, right? If there is no chance to ask by voice, yes. So, dear Swami, thank you. Unfortunately, I don't have the opportunity to ask you a question by voice, but I would like to hear your opinion as an Aurobindo specialist. Please tell me if there are intersections of Aurobindo's theory of supermind, divine consciousness, and cosmopsychism with his political and social views, like the Euro-Christian theory. If there is one God in the world, then there should be one ruler in the state.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So to give you a little bit of historical background, Aurobindo, earlier in his life, when he came back from Cambridge University, he became heavily involved in the freedom movement in India because it was under British colonial rule at the time. He was one of the freedom fighters. And he was put in jail as a result of his political activities. For about a year, he was in jail. And he was a very unusual prisoner because he was immersed in spiritual practice, studying especially the Bhagavad Gita and practicing the practices in the Bhagavad Gita. And he had these remarkable spiritual realizations, which convinced him that he had basically a spiritual vocation rather than a political vocation. And he gave up all of his freedom fighting activities, and he devoted himself to spiritual practice and being a yogi, starting an ashrama. And so part of the answer to your question is that you have to look at Aurobindo diachronically. It's very important not to think that he remained a kind of freedom fighter for his entire life. That's not right. He was a freedom fighter in his early period, and he had certain political views about the need to kick the British out of India and self-rule. That was very important for him. And then there's this evolution where he moved away from politics and towards spirituality. And it's only then that he developed the theory of the supermind and divine consciousness and cosmopsychism. So I do think there's a phasal thing going on here, and that the political phase was an early phase. It's not that he was completely uninterested in politics later, but it was always sort of approaching political issues from a spiritual standpoint from then on. So I hope that's a short answer to the question.
Yes, thank you. So maybe anybody else would like to?
And, oh, sorry, and just to add one
Yes.
more thing, if you're interested in Aurobindo's more mature views on politics and political states, there's an entire book on that issue called The Human Cycle, where he talks about these things in detail. Yeah.
So, well, if there are no more questions, probably it's 9 o'clock in the evening here in Moscow. So I think that we had a very interesting and very fruitful conversation today, and thank you again for your presentation. It was a pleasure to hear and to meet you here online. So I welcome everyone who would watch the record of this seminar. Also, if you would have any questions, to not hesitate and ask them, to write them, and we will pass them to Swami Medhananda. So thank you everybody for your time, your attention, your interest and passionate listening. So thank you again, and have a good day, have a good night, whatever.
Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate your questions. Thank you.
Yes,
Namaste.
thank you.
Thank you.
Namaste. Namaste.
Thank you.
So,
Take care.
Bye.